The night air in Vicksburg, Mississippi, in the autumn of 1858, was a thick, sweet thing, heavy with the ghosts of summer's heat and the promise of a cool that never quite arrived. It clung to the skin like damp muslin, carrying the scent of wood smoke, roasting pig, and something else, something coppery and ferrous that caught in the back of the throat. Down at the Ardenwood plantation, nestled in a sweeping bend of the Yazoo River, the annual harvest festival was in full, chaotic swing. From the distant grandeur of the main house, where Master Alistair Caldwell entertained his neighbors with French brandy and talk of secession, the slave quarters would have looked like a nest of fireflies, a single, sprawling bonfire painting the undersides of the cypress and live oak leaves in flickering shades of orange and blood. For the enslaved it was a night of precarious liberty, a single, lungful of air before the plunge back into the suffocating waters of servitude. The fiddle sought a frantic, joyous tune that belied the exhaustion in their bones, the product of a brutal cotton harvest that had left every back screaming and every hand raw. They danced in the packed dirt, their bare feet stomping out rhythms older than the nation that held them captive. They ate until their bellies were tight, a rare luxury, and drank the raw, scorching whiskey doled out by the overseer as a magnanimous gift. It was into this maelstrom of calculated celebration that Deputy Miller first rode, his horse skittish and wild-eyed at the noise and the flames. He wasn't there for the party. He was there because a young boy, no older than 10, had sprinted 4 miles in the dark, his chest heaving with sobs, babbling about Mr. Thorne and a terrible, terrible silence. The deputy found the silence. It was a pocket of dead air just beyond the halo of the bonfire, near the old smokehouse. The music seemed to bend around it, the laughter faltering at its edges. A small crowd of slaves stood there, their faces a gallery of muted horror, their eyes reflecting the distant fire. They parted for the lawman like reeds in a current. And there he was. Elias Thorne, the overseer of Ardenwood, lay sprawled on his back, his arms thrown wide as if to embrace the star-choked sky. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder and thick in the gut, a monument to petty cruelties and unchecked power. But the power had been checked. Utterly. His face, usually florid and contorted with a sneer or a shout, was slack, pale, and surprised. His cheap festival shirt was soaked through with a darkness that wasn't shadow. Embedded deep in his chest, just below the sternum, was the source of it all. The tool that had ended him. A felling axe. Its hickory handle, worn smooth by years of labor, pointed to the heavens like an accusing finger. The firelight caught the blade's edge, gleaming wet and red. Sheriff Brody arrived an hour later, a weary man whose face was a roadmap of compromises and disillusionment. He knelt by the body, the smell of Thorne's spilled whiskey and blood turning his stomach. He didn't need to ask who did it. The whispers had already formed a name, a phantom that was even now being swallowed by the vast, black cypress swamp that bordered the plantation. The name was Jonas. They called him Jonas of Vicksburg, though he had never set foot in the city proper more than a handful of times. His world was Ardenwood, a kingdom of white gold and black misery, ruled by the invisible hand of Alistair Caldwell and the very visible fist of Elias Thorne. Jonas was 17, though he looked both younger and older. He had the lanky, unfinished frame of a boy, but his eyes held the ancient, soul-weary stillness of a man who had seen too much and said too little. He was not born a field hand. His mother, a woman named Seraphina, had been a house servant, prized for her delicate stitchwork and her quiet dignity. Jonas had spent his first 10 years in the penumbra of the great house, a world of polished floors, hushed footsteps, and the scent of beeswax and lavender. He learned to read the moods of the white family like a farmer reads the sky, to make himself small and silent, to exist in the spaces between things. His hands, then, were for polishing silver, not for gripping the rough handle of an axe. That world shattered the day his mother was sold. The reasons were never spoken aloud, but the whispers were a poison ivy vine that snaked through the quarters. A glance held too long from Master Caldwell, a jealous fury in the mistress's eyes. A bill of sale was drawn up, and Seraphina was gone, sent downriver to the grinding sugarcane plantations of Louisiana, a place spoken of as a death sentence. Jonas didn't cry. He stood by the dust-choked drive, a small, rigid statue, and watched the wagon shrink into the shimmering heat haze until it was nothing. Something inside him calcified that day. The soft parts of him, the parts that had known a mother's touch and the quiet hum of her lullabies, turned to stone. He was sent to the fields the next morning. The sun, which he had only ever known as a pleasant warmth through the glass of the library window, became a malevolent entity, a burning eye in the sky that sought to blister his skin and boil the sweat from his pores. The cotton plants, which had been abstract patches of white from a distance, became a torment. Their branches were thorny claws that snagged his clothes and skin. The bolls, when they opened, were deceptively soft, but the husks were sharp-edged razors that sliced his fingertips until they were a constant, throbbing agony. It was Elias Thorne who oversaw his transformation. Thorne had arrived at Ardenwood a year prior, a man from the Tennessee hills with pale, hungry eyes and a disposition soured by a life of being looked down upon by men like Caldwell. He was a poor white man given a taste of absolute power, and he wielded it with the clumsy, brutal enthusiasm of a child with a hammer. He saw the house-bred softness in Jonas as a personal insult, a flaw in the machinery he was tasked to run. He decided to grind it out of the boy. Thorne's cruelty was not always physical, though the lash was a constant presence, its whistle a part of the plantation's daily soundtrack. His true gift was for psychological torment. He would call Jonas by his mother's name, his voice dripping with a sneering mockery. He would hold up Jonas's bloodied hands for the others to see, proclaiming, "Look here, the little prince is learning what real work feels like." He would assign him the most grueling tasks, clearing new ground in the snake-infested swamp, digging drainage ditches in the thick, sucking clay, his body sinking into the earth he was meant to tame. And he would give Jonas the axe. It was an old, heavy felling axe, its head pitted with rust, its edge a thing of constant maintenance. You saw in T5 the Austray. At first, the tool was an enemy. It was clumsy and monstrously heavy, sending jarring vibrations up his arms with every poorly aimed swing. His misses would gouge the earth, or glance off a tree trunk, with a sickening thud that echoed his own inadequacy. Thorne would stand and watch, a thin smile playing on his lips. "That tree ain't scared of you, boy. You gotta make it scared of you." But over the years, a change occurred. Jonas grew into the axe, and the axe grew into him. His lanky frame filled out with the hard, ropey muscle forged by relentless labor. His hands, once a map of blisters and cuts, became calloused and hard as cured leather. He learned the rhythm of the swing, the precise arc that delivered the blade with maximum force. He learned to read the grain of a cypress, to know just where to strike, to feel the tremor as the tree's life force gave way. The axe became an extension of his will. The thud of the blade biting deep into wood became a satisfying, percussive punctuation to the silent, screaming rage that lived inside him. In a world where he owned nothing, not even his own body, he owned the swing of the axe. It was a terrible and intimate form of power. His only solace was Old Man Silas, a man whose skin was the color of dark, rich soil and whose face was a testament to a long, hard life. Silas had been at Ardenwood since before Caldwell was born. He was the plantation's resident mystic, a keeper of the old ways, a repository of stories that stretched back to Africa. He taught Jonas how to find edible roots in the swamp, how to read the stars to tell the time, how to listen to the whispers of the wind in the Spanish moss. "That anger you carry, boy," Silas told him one evening, their backs against a crumbling wall of the slave quarters. "It's a fire. Can cook your food, or it can burn your house down. You gotta learn to bank it. Keep the coals hot, but don't let the flames show. Silas also spoke of the cypress swamp, not as a place of death, but of life and secrets. That swamp, don't care about Master Caldwell's deeds and titles. It's its own master. It swallows what it wants, hides what it wants. A man could get lost in there and be reborn. He would point to the great looming cypress trees, their knees poking from the black water. They remember everything, Jonas. They see it all. And so the swamp became Jonas's church, his sanctuary. In the stolen hours before dawn or after dusk, he would slip away from the suffocating order of the fields and lose himself in its primordial chaos. The air there was different, thick, with the smell of decay and fecundity, of life feeding on death. He would stand in the cathedral-like silence, broken only by the croak of a bullfrog or the sudden splash of a gar, and feel the rage inside him quiet to a low hum. The Spanish moss, hanging like the gray beards of ancient prophets, seemed to absorb his sorrow. The black, still water reflected the sky but revealed none of its own depths. It was a place of endings and beginnings, a place where a boy could disappear. He would often bring the axe with him, not for work, but for comfort. Its weight in his hand was a familiar anchor in the disorienting landscape. The summer of 1858 was a furnace. A drought settled over the Mississippi Delta, and the sky turned a pitiless, bleached white. The cotton plants, starved for water, produced small, stubborn bolls. The harvest was thin, and Alistair Caldwell's mood, always precarious, soured into a constant, simmering rage. That rage flowed downhill, as it always did, from the big house to the overseer's cottage, and from there it was unleashed upon the fields in a torrent of violence. Elias Thorne, facing the prospect of a poor showing and Caldwell's displeasure, became a demon. The workday, already a sully, sun-up to sundown affair, was extended into the twilight hours. Water rations were cut. The lash sang its terrible song with a new frequency. Thorne seemed to be everywhere at once, his horse a pale specter moving through the dying rows of cotton, his voice a raw-edged bark that flayed the nerves. He fixated on Jonas with a renewed, venomous intensity. It was as if the boy's silent endurance was a mirror reflecting Thorne's own failures. He saw defiance in Jonas's stillness, insolence in his downcast eyes. One sweltering afternoon, a young woman named Alara, whose laughter was one of the few bright things left in the quarters, collapsed from heat stroke. Jonas, working in the next row, dropped his sack and moved to help her. Before he could reach her, Thorne was there, his shadow falling over them both. "Get your hands off her, boy," he snarled. "She's not your concern. She's Caldwell's property. And she'll work, till she drops, just like the rest of you." Jonas froze, his hands hovering over Alara's still form. He looked up at Thorne, and for the first time he didn't look away. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met the overseer's pale, furious gaze. In that moment, the air between them crackled. It was a silent, elemental challenge. A slave boy, caked in dirt and sweat, his body legally no more than a piece of livestock, was looking at his master's proxy as an equal. Thorne's face purpled. He raised his riding crop. "You look at the ground when I speak to you," he hissed, and brought the leather down across Jonas's face. The blow was sharp, stinging. A red wheal instantly rose on Jonas's cheek. But he did not flinch. He did not look away. He simply held Thorne's gaze, and in the depths of his eyes, a coal that had been banked for 7 years began to glow. Thorne, unnerved by the boy's unnatural stillness, struck him again, then again, driving him back. "Get back to work, all of you, or you'll get the same." Jonas turned and walked back to his row, the pain on his face a distant, irrelevant thing. He picked up his cotton sack. But as his fingers closed around the rough canvas, he was thinking of the smooth, familiar grain of the hickory axe handle. He was thinking of the satisfying weight of its head. He was thinking of the clean, final sound of a blade splitting wood. The announcement of the Harvest Festival a month later was met not with joy, but with a sense of deep, collective dread. It felt like a mockery, a grotesque parody of celebration in a season of suffering. The harvest had been abysmal, and the mood at Ardenwood was funereal. Yet Master Caldwell, in a fit of what he likely considered noblesse oblige, insisted the tradition be upheld. He would provide a pig and 3 barrels of whiskey. They would have their night of revelry. It was an order, not an invitation. In the days leading up to the festival, a strange energy settled over the plantation. It was the oppressive stillness before a thunderstorm. The slaves moved through their chores with a grim, mechanical efficiency. Thorne, for his part, seemed to swell with a kind of manic glee. He strutted about the grounds, boasting of the festivities, treating the impending party as a personal triumph, a testament to his ability to wring a harvest from a dead season. On the evening of the festival, Jonas found Silas by the edge of the swamp, watching the sun bleed out across the horizon. The old man was carving a small bird from a piece of cypress root, his gnarled fingers moving with an impossible grace. "You feel it." "Don't you, boy?" Silas said without looking up. "The air is tight. Something's coming to a head." "He humiliated her," Jonas said, his voice low and tight. He was referring to an incident from the day before. Thorne, in a drunken fit, had cornered Ilara by the well and forced her to sing for him, laughing as her voice trembled with fear and shame. Silas stopped carving. He looked at Jonas, his old eyes filled with a profound sadness. "There are 1,000 humiliations in this life, son. 1,000 cuts. You can't bleed for every one of them, or you'll have nothing left." "What if I don't want to stop the bleeding?" Jonas asked. "What if I want to make the one holding the knife bleed instead?" Silas sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. He held up the half-finished bird. "This world is like this wood. Hard, full of knots. You can break yourself against it, or you can find the grain. You can carve something out of it. Something small. Something that's yours." He looked toward the growing bonfire in the distance. "A fire like that, it wants to eat everything. You get too close, it'll burn you to ash. Best to stay in the shadows." But Jonas was tired of the shadows. As he walked toward the fire, the sounds of the fiddle and the forced laughter grated on his nerves. The smell of the roasting pig, which should have been enticing, was the smell of a sacrifice on an unholy altar. He saw the faces of his people, masks of joy stretched thin over landscapes of pain. He saw Ilara, trying to lose herself in the dance, her movements jerky and haunted. And he saw Elias Thorne. The overseer was in his element, a king in his squalid court. He had a tin cup of whiskey in one hand and a whip coiled at his belt. He was drunk, his face flushed, and his eyes glittering with a sweaty, malevolent charisma. He moved through the crowd, clapping men on the back with a force that was more blow than gesture, his eyes lingering on the women with a predatory ownership. He was the center of this universe, the sun around which their broken lives were forced to orbit. Jonas watched him from the edge of the light, his body a column of pure, cold stillness. The fire had been banked for 7 years. The coals were white-hot. He felt a strange calm settle over him, a clarity that was almost peaceful. He wasn't thinking about the consequences, about the posse, the hounds, the inevitable and brutal end. The future had collapsed into a single shining point. He was only thinking about the swing, about the geometry of it, about the precise and perfect arc that could bring a tall tree crashing to the earth. He slipped away from the fire, his movements silent and practiced. He went to the tool shed, its door hanging ajar. The tools were all there, their metal heads gleaming faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the cracks in the wall. Shovels, hoes, scythes, and the axe. His axe. He picked it up. The handle felt like it had been carved to fit his hand, and his hand alone. Its weight was a comfort, a certainty, in a world of lies. It felt like an instrument of truth. When he returned to the clearing, Thorn was standing near the smokehouse, his back to the darkness. He was telling a loud, crude joke to a small group of terrified slaves, his laughter booming out over the music. He took a long swallow from his cup, then threw his head back, his thick neck exposed to the night sky. Jonas stepped out of the shadows. He did not run. He walked, his pace measured, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. The world seemed to slow down, the frantic notes of the fiddle stretching into long, mournful drones. The firelight seemed to dim, focusing all of its glow on the back of Thorn's neck. He could see the sweat beading on the man's skin. He could smell the sour stench of his whiskey. He was 10 feet away. 5 feet. The men with Thorn saw him then, their eyes widening in disbelief and terror, their mouths opened to shout a warning, but the sound caught in their throats. Thorn must have sensed the change in the air, the sudden vacuum of sound. He turned, a drunken, quizzical look on his face. What in the hell? His eyes met Jonas's. In that final, frozen moment, Elias Thorn saw the boy from the fields. He saw the quiet house servant he had tried to break. He saw 7 years of silent, accumulated hatred. He saw his own death arriving, walking toward him with a calm, unhurried gait. He saw the fire in Jonas's eyes, no longer banked coals, but a roaring, all-consuming inferno. Jonas raised the axe. It felt impossibly light. He put his entire life into the swing. The stolen mother, the burning sun, the slicing cotton bolls, the sting of the lash, the shame in Alara's eyes, the 1,000 daily cuts. The arc was perfect. It was pure. It was his. The sound was not a crack, but a wet, solid thud, like an axe sinking into a ripe melon. It was a sound that cut through the fiddle music, through the laughter, through the entire artifice of the night. For a heartbeat, there was a profound and absolute silence. Elias Thorn stood there, a look of comical surprise on his face, his mouth still open. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed, a puppet whose strings had been cut. The screams came then, a tidal wave of sound. The fiddle shrieked to a halt. The dance dissolved into a panicked scramble. The illusion of the festival shattered into a million pieces, revealing the raw, terrified reality underneath. Jonas stood over the body, the axe still in his hands. He looked at what he had done, at the dark blood pooling in the dirt. He felt nothing. Not triumph, not remorse, not fear. He felt only a great and terrible emptiness. The fire was out. He was just a boy, holding an axe, covered in the ashes of his own rage. He looked up and saw their faces in the firelight. Old man Silas, his expression one of tragic understanding. Alara, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and something that looked like awe. They were all staring at him, the boy who had done the unthinkable, who had broken the one unbreakable rule. Then the spell broke. A shout went up from the direction of the big house. The dogs began to bonseniaha, bark, a frantic, savage sound. Jonas knew he had only moments. He turned and ran, not toward the road, not toward the river, but toward the one place that had ever offered him sanctuary. He ran toward the black, waiting mouth of the cypress swamp. He plunged into its shadows, the axe still clutched in his hand, a final, terrible part of him. The branches and vines clawed at him, but he did not feel them. He was a ghost moving through a landscape of ghosts, the sounds of the hunt, the shouting men, the baying of the hounds, fading behind him as the swamp swallowed him whole. The search for Jonas of Vicksburg became a local legend. Sheriff Brody, a man who preferred the simple brutalities of bar fights and land disputes, found himself leading a posse into a place that defied all human order. The cypress swamp was a labyrinth of black water, primeval trees, and sucking mud. It was a place where sound died, where direction became meaningless, where the air itself felt heavy with ancient, watchful spirits. They took the hounds in, bloodhounds famed for their ability to follow a trail days old. The dogs led them to the edge of the swamp, whining and circling where Jonas had plunged into the undergrowth. They followed a trail of broken branches and footprints in the mud for a quarter of a mile. They found a single drop of blood, black on a palmetto leaf, Thorn's blood. And then, at the edge of a deep, still bayou, whose water was the color of black tea, the trail vanished. The dogs grew frantic, then fell silent, their tails tucked between their legs, a low growl of fear rumbling in their chests. They would go no further. The men pushed on, poling through the water in flat-bottomed skiffs, their shotgun barrels glinting in the dappled, uncertain light. They shouted Jonas's name until their throats were raw, the sound swallowed by the thick moss and the vast silence. They found nothing, no body, no tracks, no sign of the felling axe. For 3 days they searched. They were tormented by clouds of mosquitoes, spooked by the silent glide of water moccasins and the sudden, terrifying bellow of an unseen alligator. The swamp seemed to play tricks on them. They saw movement in their peripheral vision that was never there. They heard whispers that were only the rustle of leaves. It felt as if the place itself was protecting the boy, hiding him in its dark, wet heart. On the 4th day, with his men exhausted and near mutiny, Sheriff Brody called off the hunt. In the official report, Jonas was listed as escaped, presumed deceased. It was the neatest explanation. A boy, even one who knew the swamp, could not survive in there for long. He would have succumbed to starvation, to a snakebite, to the fever. He would have been taken by an alligator. The swamp keeps its own. Alistair Caldwell hired a new overseer, a grim, efficient man who ruled with fear but without Thorn's sadistic flourish. The Harvest Festival was never held again. But a story like that does not die. It goes underground. It becomes a whisper in the slave quarters, a cautionary tale, a prayer. The official version was that Jonas had been a bad slave, a murderer who met a grim, deserved end in the wilderness. But the other version, the one told in the dark, was different. Some said Jonas had drowned himself in the bayou, choosing a quick death in the black water over the slow one of a lynching. Others said he'd found a way through, navigating the swamp's secret passages until he reached the river and stowed away on a northbound boat, a free man. But the story that took the deepest root, the one that was told to wide-eyed children for generations, was more mythic. They said that the swamp had recognized him, had recognized the wildness and the pain in his heart, and it had made him one of its own. They said he still lived there, a silent, watchful guardian of its depths. They said that on still nights, if you listened closely, you could hear the faint rhythmic thud of an axe echoing from deep within the cypress stands, a sound of tireless, unending justice. The felling axe, the symbol of his bondage, had become the instrument of his legend. Epilogue, 1877. The man from the Freedmen's Bureau was young, earnest, and from Boston, with a notebook full of questions and a belief that the world could be neatly cataloged and understood. He sat on the crumbling porch of a small cabin, miles from the ruins of what had once been the Ardenwood plantation. Across from him sat an old man, his face a beautiful, intricate carving of time and sorrow. His name was Silas. "I'm documenting the history of this region," the young man explained, "the transition from the old ways to the new. I've heard stories about a boy named Jonas." Silas looked out over the fields, which were now parceled out to sharecroppers. The great house was a blackened shell, burned by Union troops years ago. The cotton was gone, replaced by corn and collards. The land was quieter now, but no less haunted. "Some things ain't for writing in books," Silas said, his voice a low rasp. "Some stories are for the wind to carry." "They say he killed his overseer," the young man pressed gently, "with an axe, during a festival. Silas nodded slowly. Elias Thorne. He was a hard man. The kind of man this land breeds when it's been poisoned by a bad idea. He paused, remembering. The world is a hard piece of wood, I told him. Full of knots. I told him to find the grain, to carve something. I think he found the grain all right. He just used an axe instead of a whittling knife. What happened to him? Did he escape? Silas stared for a long time at the dark line of trees on the horizon, the ever-present wall of the cypress swamp. Escape? No. Ain't no escaping what you are, what you've done. That boy carried a lifetime of pain in his heart. When he swung that axe, he let it all out. One clean swing. He cut the knot, but a blow like that, it echoes. It changes the man who swings it. He leaned forward, his ancient eyes locking with the young man's. You from the city, you think in terms of captured or free, dead or alive. But the world down here is older than that. More complicated. That swamp, it doesn't think in straight lines. Jonas went in there carrying a rage that was as old and as wild as the swamp itself, so maybe it didn't kill him. Maybe it just recognized him. Maybe he just went home. The young man from Boston wrote furiously in his notebook, trying to capture the poetry and the strangeness of the old man's words. He was writing a history of facts, of dates and names and laws. But he knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that the true history was not in his book. It was in the hushed story of a boy and an axe. It was in the enduring, watchful silence of the swamp. It was a story not of a crime, but of a kind of terrible, necessary magic, an act of violent alchemy that had transformed a slave boy into a legend, a ghost, a piece of the land itself, his final, ambiguous fate, a testament to the fact that in a system of absolute injustice, the only true justice might lie in an act so profound it shatters the world and disappears into myth, leaving only a haunting echo, like the distant, phantom strike of an axe in the deep woods.